Something happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home, and investigators aren't explaining why. Long after midnight, federal agents quietly returned to the property. No announcements, no statements, only flashes of light cutting through the dark. By morning, everything felt different. Briefings stopped. The family's tone shifted. And sources now say something recovered inside the house changed the direction of the case. Tonight, we're examining what makes investigators go back, what they could be looking for, and why this moment matters more than anyone expected. Subscribe now, because what was found may determine what happens next before time runs out forever for everyone watching this case unfold now closely now. The timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance immediately drew attention, not because it was confusing, but because it was almost too ordinary. Nothing about that evening suggested disruption. Nothing suggested urgency. She spent her time the same way she had countless nights before, surrounded by familiar faces, moving through routines that never required a second thought. Conversations were casual. The atmosphere was calm. There were no raised voices, no sudden departures, no moments anyone would later remember as unusual. It was the kind of normal that investigators are trained to question, because normal can sometimes hide the exact moment everything changes. Nancy returned home later that night, and that detail would become one of the most examined points in the entire investigation. The exact time matters. The exact circumstances matter. Because once she crossed that threshold and entered her home, the timeline narrowed in a way investigators could not ignore. From that moment forward, every minute carried weight. Every action either confirmed routine or suggested deviation. And somewhere inside that narrow window, Nancy Guthrie vanished without leaving behind the kind of evidence investigators expect to be. Why the next morning, there was no sign of her. No indication she had planned to leave. No indication she had prepared for anything beyond the next day. Her absence did not follow a pattern of departure. It followed a pattern of interruption. That distinction immediately changes how investigators approach a case. Because when someone leaves intentionally, they take pieces of their life with them. When someone disappears unexpectedly, those pieces remain exactly where they were left. Inside the home, investigators began with the basics. Entry points were examined first. Doors, windows, locks. These areas often provide the first confirmation of forced access. But in this case, there were no obvious signs of intrusion. Nothing broken, nothing displaced, nothing that suggested someone forced their way inside. And that kind of stillness raises deeper concerns than visible damage ever could. Because forced entry explains presence. The absence of forced entry raises questions about access. Investigators also looked for signs of resistance. Signs that Nancy had struggled. Signs that she had tried to stop whatever was happening. But again, the home remained quiet, undisturbed, familiar. The environment told a story of continuity, not conflict. And that contradiction forced investigators to consider possibilities that extend beyond sudden violence. It suggested timing. It suggested awareness. It suggested the possibility that whatever happened unfolded in a way that did not immediately trigger alarm. When local authorities began processing the scene, the case was treated as a disappearance. That classification determines early priorities. It shapes how evidence is collected. It shapes how resources are assigned. But that classification did not remain in place for long. Because as investigators examined the details more closely, the situation began to shift. Certain indicators suggested complexity. Certain patterns suggested planning. And those indicators prompted federal attention. Federal investigators do not enter cases without reason. Their involvement signals that something about the disappearance exceeds ordinary circumstances. It means investigators believe there may be elements that require broader analysis. Communication patterns, behavioral patterns, digital patterns. These factors often reveal information that physical environments cannot. As federal agents examined Nancy Guthrie's home, their focus extended beyond visible evidence. They examined routines, habits, timing, because disappearance is rarely defined by a single moment. It is defined by the disruption of predictable behavior, and identifying that disruption requires understanding exactly what should have happened and exactly what did not. What stood out most was the absence of transition. There was no clear indication Nancy had prepared to leave. No indication she had expected interruption. Her environment remained anchored in normalcy. And that kind of frozen routine often represents the precise point investigators concentrate on, because it marks the boundary between presence and absence. The timeline remained narrow, and narrow timelines create pressure. They limit opportunity. They limit movement. They limit explanation. Every unanswered question becomes more significant. Every unaccounted minute becomes more valuable. Investigators understood that whatever happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home happened quickly. It happened quietly, and it happened in a way that left behind uncertainty instead of clarity. And uncertainty is where investigations truly begin. Once federal investigators assumed a central role, the direction of the investigation changed in ways the public could not fully see. Their presence did not just increase resources. It increased precision. Because federal investigations are designed to reconstruct events in ways that eliminate assumption. Every detail must align. Every sequence must make sense. And when something refuses to fit, that detail becomes the center of attention. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators began examining behavioral continuity. This involves understanding how she normally moved through her environment, where she placed personal items, when she used certain devices, how she ended her evenings, because human behavior follows patterns, and those patterns create a measurable baseline. When that baseline breaks, it reveals the exact point disruption occurred. One of the most revealing elements in modern investigations is digital silence. Phones, networks, and connected systems document activity automatically. They record presence without intention. And when those systems stop recording expected behavior, that absence becomes evidence. Investigators examined when Nancy's devices were last active, when connections stopped, when signals disappeared, because digital timelines often confirm or contradict physical assumptions. Another area of focus involved environmental consistency. Lighting, positioning, placement. These details may appear insignificant, but they reflect sequence. A light left on suggests continuation. A light turned off suggests closure. A misplaced object suggests interruption. Investigators analyze these indicators not individually, but collectively, because together they reconstruct the final confirmed moments of presence. Federal investigators also evaluate access, not forced access, familiar access, because when environments show no signs of intrusion, investigators consider whether access was voluntary, expected, or unnoticed. That determination influences every theory that follows. It shapes the list of possibilities. It defines the direction of inquiry. At a certain point, the investigation reached a stage where the home was released. This normally indicates that initial processing has been completed, that primary evidence has been collected. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators returned. And return visits carry specific meaning. They occur when new information changes earlier interpretations. They occur when investigators recognize something they did not initially understand. This return suggests the investigation was evolving, not publicly, but internally, because investigations rarely move in straight lines. They move in revisions. Each discovery forces reassessment. Each reassessment brings investigators closer to sequence. During this stage, investigators also examine timing consistency. This involves comparing known activity with expected activity. Any gap becomes critical. Any unexplained delay becomes significant, because disappearance always exists between two confirmed points: the last moment of certainty and the first moment of absence. Federal investigators also consider communication patterns, not just messages received, but messages expected, because communication absence can be just as revealing as communication presence. A missed routine message, a missed routine response. These small deviations often mark the exact moment circumstances changed. What makes cases like this complex is not the presence of evidence. It is the interpretation of absence, because absence cannot be photographed, cannot be measured directly. It must be inferred. And inference requires caution. investigators continued refining their understanding, narrowing sequence, eliminating impossibilities, confirming probabilities, because every investigation moves toward a single objective: certainty. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, certainty remained just beyond reach. But investigators continued closing that distance. As the investigation progressed, its focus shifted from broad reconstruction to precise verification. Early stages are defined by collection. Later stages are defined by confirmation, because once investigators establish a probable sequence, their objective becomes proving that sequence beyond uncertainty. This stage involves testing consistency. Every timeline must align across physical, digital, and behavioral evidence. Any contradiction forces reevaluation. Any alignment strengthens confidence. Investigators are not searching for theories. They are searching for confirmation. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the environment remained the central reference point. Because environments do not forget. They preserve sequence. They preserve timing. And when investigators revisit environments, they do so with new perspective. What once appeared ordinary may now appear significant. Investigators also examine decision timing, because disappearance involves decision, whether voluntary or involuntary, immediate or gradual. That decision always occurs within a measurable window, and identifying that window defines the case. Another critical focus involves movement probability. Could Nancy have left without detection? Could someone have entered without detection? These questions are answered through reconstruction. Investigators physically retrace possible movements. They test assumptions against reality. At the same time, investigators analyze behavioral deviation. Did Nancy act differently that evening? Did anything interrupt her routine earlier than expected? These subtle changes often precede larger events. Federal investigations also prioritize sequence stability, because stable sequences allow investigators to predict missing steps, and predicting missing steps leads to discovery. During this phase, public information often decreases, not because progress stops, but because progress becomes sensitive. Releasing information prematurely can compromise verification, can introduce interference, it can disrupt confirmation. Investigators continued refining timeline accuracy, minute by minute, action by action, because disappearance is never truly invisible. It leaves patterns. It leaves disruption. The investigation also focused on control. Who controlled timing? Who controlled sequence? Because control reveals intent, and intent defines outcome. As verification continued, investigators moved closer to final sequence confirmation. This stage determines investigative direction. It determines resolution path. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remained defined by absence. But absence is never empty. It contains structure, contains timing, contains truth. And investigators remained focused on reaching that truth. When a ransom deadline passes, people expect resolution. They expect movement. They expect noise. But in investigations like this, the moment a deadline expires is rarely the end of pressure. It becomes a measurement. Investigators watch what changes and what doesn't. If new messages appear, every word is examined for urgency, for hesitation, for control. Continued contact suggests calculation. It suggests someone believes they still have influence over how this ends. If communication stops, that silence carries its own meaning. Investigators compare it to everything that came before. Timing, behavior, digital traces. Silence can signal fear, can signal strategy, or it can signal that the situation has already shifted beyond the original demands. What appears quiet publicly is often where the most critical work begins privately. Many assume that paying a ransom would close the investigation. It doesn't. Complicates it. Financial transfers create pathways investigators can follow. Money moves, and when it moves, it exposes decisions, locations, and identities. What looks like escape can quickly become evidence. The objective has never been just to respond. It has been to understand, to determine who created this situation, how it unfolded, and whether it was designed to mislead from the beginning. As time moves forward, answers may arrive in fragments, through confirmations, through legal action, through moments that seem small until they are connected. What remains certain is this: the turning point has already happened. The actions taken during those critical hours continue to shape everything now. And when the full truth finally surfaces, it will not be defined by deadlines. It will be defined by evidence, by timing, and by the decisions someone believed would never be uncovered. Until then, the silence surrounding this case is not emptiness. It is distance between question and proof, and investigators are still closing that distance carefully now for everyone watching closely.